Hey Navigators, today we're at Fort Desoto Park. Here's the fort. And today is a leisurely ride through the park, campgrounds, fishing piers, this fort, awesome beaches. It's one of the places I went to when I grew up, so this is gonna be a trip down memory lane. Anyway, I can't wait for you to join me, so let's hit the road. Today we're in Pinellas County, off the coast of St. Petersburg, at the historic and unique Fort Desoto Park that has beautiful beaches, a cozy campground, and a really cool fort. All right, this is a picture of Fort Desoto. It looks like a V, and it's made up of these small islands called keys or cays. And these islands are actually sandy islands that are usually part of the coral reef system, which I didn't know until this video. So we're going to start out at the top, at the boat ramps, which overlook the water, and it's beautiful. And this is where the boaters take their boats out to the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, depending on when you see this. And then we're going to head down just a little bit to the campgrounds, which is a great place to spend the night and enjoy nature. Then we're going to head all the way down to the road to the T and take a left. Now, at the end of this road is a place called Conception Key. And from there, overlooking the water, you can see the Skyway bridge in the distance. It looks really cool. Then we're going to head back, and on the way back, we're going to stop by the East Beach, which has this really nice fishing pier. And then we're going to continue down past the base of the V, and we're going to go all the way up to the North Beach. And this is where I spent a lot of my childhood, and this is where the nicest beaches on the island are located. And then we're going to finish up our ride by heading back to that bottom of the V where the fort is. And this fort is really neat, it has a cool history, and it overlooks these beautiful waters. So let's get on our Navis and go. All right, here we are starting off at the boat ramps. They had just opened Fort Desoto recently because it had to be repaired and fixed up after the 2 hurricanes that hit us. There was a lot of debris, a lot of trees were down. In the campground area, a lot of the electrical outlets and everything had to be replaced. I think over 240 different outlets and electrical systems had to be replaced in that area. So as they cleaned areas up, they would open up those sections. And literally, like about a week before this ride was the first time the entire Fort Desoto Park was available to explore. You know, I love these early morning rides, especially when it's cool and clear. The blue sky just makes the water look so amazing, doesn't it? I mean, check this out. It's so great. Obviously, people can come here and put their own boats in the water for recreation or fishing. And I think there's a ferry that will actually take you from here to the Egmont Key, which is an island just off the coast here. This is a great place to start our ride because the water looks so inviting. If only the Navi could also be amphibious. How cool would that be? I'll have to talk to Honda about that. So you can see on the right here the natural vegetation that occurs in Florida near the water. It usually consists of mangroves, and then of course you also have the various palms. Now I grew up on the water, on a canal with a seawall, but near us, across the canal, was this undeveloped neighborhood. And in there it had these really shallow canals that were surrounded by mangroves. And so we could go there as kids and play. We used to play Guadalcanal, which was basically playing army in the water with a canal. But it was so cool because it was like almost perfectly made for kids. We would swim across the canal to go to this beachy, shallow canal with mangroves, and we'd play army over there, and then we'd swim back home and eat dinner. It was awesome. Every time I see mangroves, I think of that time as a kid. So this is the Fort Desoto campground. Now my memory says that we camped here at Fort Desoto when I was a kid. I asked one of my brothers who has the best memory in the family, and he said we never did. We camped a lot, though, as a family, but we never camped here, which I'm going to have to believe him because his memory is better than mine, but I could have sworn we did. I know we camped a lot in Florida, but I guess it was never here. We camped a lot because I come from a very large family. I'm the youngest of 8 children, and my parents were kids during the Great Depression. They were newlyweds right after World War II, so they weren't cheap, but they were exceptionally frugal. They grew up where resources were limited, and so my parents never spent money they didn't have to. But when they spent it well, so again, they weren't cheap. So with a large family like that, we could never afford hotels, especially back, in the 70s, 80s. We could never do that. They weren't nearly as prevalent or as cheap as they are now. So camping was our option, which was fine for my parents because they were kind of outdoorsy people anyway. After World War II, my dad got a GI Bill, and he and my mom bought some land in Massachusetts and literally built their house by hand. They bought a tar paper shack, and they lived in that while they dug a basement. They then sealed the basement and then moved the tar paper shack on top of it and then built the house around it. They removed trees and massive stumps by hand. I mean, they were very able people. So camping, compared to that, was relaxation. We had a little pop-up camper that my parents would sleep in, and then we had this large tent that would attach to that pop-up camper where we would all sleep. So camping was a very formative experience in my childhood. So when it comes to keys, or cays, as I mentioned earlier, the largest portion of Fort Desoto, the V in that map, is a key called Mullet Key. And there's another key offshore, it's like an island, and it's called Egmont Key. And you can only get there by boat. But in the history of this area, Mullet Key and Egmont Key had the most interest from the military as locations to develop defenses to protect the Tampa Bay area. Now, you're not supposed to ride your motorcycle on sidewalks, but it's very, very early. The park just opened. It's about 7:30 in the morning, and no one's here, and it's February. So just thought it'd be easier and quicker just to ride up here. But I love these retro-style shelters. They overlook the water, which is gorgeous. But they're just, I don't know if they were made in the 60s or 70s, I don't know. But under these shelters, not here, but at the North Beach, which we'll get to in a little bit, that was our go-to location as a large family to go to the beach because the beaches were amazing, but the shelters could hold us all, and they were shaded, and they had grills and everything, so it was a perfect spot. My parents loved coming to Fort Desoto for outings. And also because it was a park and there was a paid entrance. It wasn't a lot, it wasn't free, and it had beautiful beaches, but it wasn't the most popular beaches in the area like St. Pete Beach or Clearwater Beach. So you got the best of both worlds. You got people who are willing to pay a little bit were the ones that came in. You got the awesome beaches, you got these great shelters, and you had this cool fort, which is when you have a lot of kids, they could just run around and play and imagine and make believe and play tag and everything. So this was like the place my parents liked to go the most when they went to the beach. Now here in the distance, you can see the Skyway Bridge. The Skyway Bridge has such an interesting history. The Skyway Bridge that's out there now was built, I believe, in the 90s. I haven't researched this. I'm just doing this from memory. But the original Skyway Bridge was two bridges, one that went north and one that went south. And these bridges connect the St. Pete area to the Sarasota area. And one of my brothers lived down in Sarasota. So we'd go over the Skyway bridges quite often. And they were these old style bridges that at the top had the metal grate that you could see through and the tires would vibrate as you go over, you know. And as a kid, looking out the window at the peak of the bridge, you could see through to the water. And as someone that's afraid of heights, that was not a pleasant experience. So it was May 1981, I think. And I was in school. I remember being in school when this happened, but there was a torrential downpour. And the rain was so thick that you really couldn't see in front of you. And a large boat, like a tanker, couldn't see either and actually ran into one of the spans, the span going south towards Sarasota. And it actually sheared the top of that span in half, and the southern part of that top of the bridge actually collapsed into the water. The sad thing is that as people were driving up that span to the peak, they couldn't see that it was gone because it was at the peak. And also, it was raining so hard that they could barely see in front of them. So during this torrential downpour, cars just drove off the top of the bridge, including a bus full of people. One truck actually drove off and landed on top of the tanker. Another car, there's a famous picture of this, there's another car that actually stopped right at the edge of the bridge. And the guy was able to get out and walk out. And I think over 30 people died that day. So what ended up happening is that they turned the northbound span, which was 2 lanes going from Sarasota to St. Pete, they turned that into single lanes going north and south. And right after the accident, it was really kind of terrifying because you're riding up this span, which is identical to the one that had collapsed. And you're riding up to it and you can see it next to you the whole time. And then suddenly at the top, the whole thing's gone. And you could see how high you are and just imagine the fear of the people that just drove off there, their stomachs dropping as they just suddenly were falling and not knowing what was happening. It was just so tragic. So those spans were eventually torn down and replaced by the new Skyway Bridge, which is, I don't know, it's 30 years or 40 years old by now. And it's a beautiful bridge and it's much safer and much more easy to ride over. When you go over the new Skyway Bridge, on the right-hand side, there's still part of the old original span that had collapsed, the flat part, as you got towards the land, and they turned that into a fishing pier, and it's been a fishing pier ever since. Now, when we got here to Conception Key, I thought we would be able to see the Skyway Bridge. I mean, I could see it with my eyes, but I didn't know that the cameras had a real problem. So I'm just going to sketch. Here's what it actually looks like. Isn't that impressive? My handiwork there. So, oh my gosh, yeah. So isn't that impressive? Aren't you glad I brought you down here to look at this? All right. Let's turn around and head back. You know, it's amazing in Florida, having lived here almost my entire life. I wasn't born here, but I lived here most of my life. is the fishing piers used to just be made out of wood and eventually would get really creaky and a little scary, as they went out into the water. But now they're so robust, like this one here. It's beautiful. And I've never been someone who likes to fish. That's just me. I don't like going on boats really out into the water a lot because I don't have an escape plan, like I need to feel like I have a way out. I don't know. It's just my own. I'm crazy that way. But I've always loved people that enjoyed fishing because it's such an easy thing to do here. And it's very relaxing for people. I really wish that I enjoyed it more, but it's just one of those things you just can't force it. I think you either like fishing or you don't. You either like boating or you don't. You either like riding a Navi or you don't. And only one of those is the most important. And I'm going to let you guess which one. All right, it's time to feed Algo, the alligator. I mean, this isn't exactly swampland, but I think an alligator could make a home here. Now, you know the deal, like algorithms are paying attention about the interaction that people have when they come to videos. It lets them know the video has value. So if you could, push buttons, make comments, anything will help. I mean, if you've enjoyed this ride or any of the other rides that I've shared so far, and you would like other people to enjoy them, well, this is the way you let them know. This is the way the algorithm will point those people interested in it towards the videos. And I'd be grateful for that, but you don't have to, but I would appreciate it if you can. Oh, also, if you want me to do one of these rides in some other city in Florida, let me know. And if I can, I will. Also, I don't know if I'll be at 100 subscribers by the time this video airs. Hopefully I will. But I haven't decided what I should do to celebrate 100 subscribers. So if you have any ideas, seriously, any ideas, if you could leave them in the comments, I'd appreciate it. Because honestly, I don't know. And I should celebrate the small victories, right? All right, stats. Are there any stats I can tell you about a place that's not inhabited except by visitors during the hours the park is open? That's gonna be hard. Let's see. Well, there were inhabitants here back around 1000 to 1500 AD. The Tokobogans, which we've talked about a lot in the Safety Harbor video and the Clearwater video and the Oldsmar video, they lived here too. They ate fish and clams and conch and oysters. But that's about it. Since then, it's just kind of been a park for visitors. It's 1,136 acres spread across 5 islands. Oh, it has a paved trail that you could use for biking or walking or running. You can rent bikes or canoes or kayaks. It's got everything. If you just want to come to the beach and hang out, you can boat, you can camp, you can picnic. It's pet friendly. You can fish. I mean, what more could you ask? So that's it, really. As far as stats go, that's all I could give you. Sorry, I wish I could do more. So this is the North Beach. This is the most popular place in the Fort DeSoto Park. This is where my family and I went. We would stop at one of the shelters here. We'd get our grill going. We'd get the food going. And then we'd go out to the beach beyond here. I'm sorry, but aren't these shelters just cool? And the great thing is you're so close to the water. Now, things have changed since I was a kid, especially with the hurricanes and the storms and the sand deposits and whatnot. But when I used to come here as a kid, there was basically a sandbar that was probably about 50 yards out. And it wouldn't go the entire length of the beach, but a certain portion of it. So it would stop a lot of the bigger waves. So when you were a little kid, there was a portion of the beach that was basically smooth and shallow, which allowed you to play in it, and your parents didn't have to worry about riptide or anything like that. And you could just play out there. And if you wanted to actually get the full experience of the Gulf, you could just walk out or swim out to the sandbar. And then on the other side of the sandbar, you would get the bigger waves and the stronger currents and things like that. But it looks like now that most of that has been filled in over time with deposits, either just from natural tidal movements or maybe the hurricanes have just pushed a lot of sand in. But that was another feature that made it really a great place for my parents to bring us, because there was a really big beach with a really big portion of water that was safe for kids to play in. Okay, here's Fort Desoto, and this is such an interesting place. When we were kids, we used to run around here and play, but it has an interesting history, but one that is almost uneventful. It's so weird. Let me give you the rundown. So back in 1849, a detachment of U.S. Army engineers, including future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, surveyed this area. And they recommended Egmont Key, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. You can see it from the top of the fort. But they recommended that Egmont Key be fortified and the other islands in the area, including this one, to be reserved for possible military use. And Mullet Key, which again is the major portion of Fort Desoto Park, was declared a military reservation later that year.
Echo. Man, you can really hear the echo in here.
But there was no attempt to fortify the islands before the start of the Civil War. Now, the Confederate forces briefly occupied Egmont Key and Mullet Key early in the Civil War, but they soon withdrew to Tampa. Now, the Union occupied the two islands by mid-July of 1861, and the close proximity of the islands to the main channel into Tampa Bay allowed the Union to actually create a naval blockade, keeping ships from going in and out of Tampa Bay. But, what does that have to do with the fort that's sitting here right now? Well, okay. Fortifications like that weren't built on the islands until the Spanish-American War. The main operation on Mullet Key was named Fort Desoto in 1900 in honor of Hernando de Soto, who was a Spanish explorer that stopped by the area at some point in history, back in the 1500s, I believe. The Army post was officially a sub-post of Fort Dade, which was constructed on Egmont Key, the island a little farther out.
Look how thick these walls are.
So these posts were to have artillery and mortars to protect Tampa Bay from invading forces. Now, the construction of this particular fort, Fort Desoto, began in November of 1898 and was completed in 1906. Now, if you look at it, it's kind of different, right? The foundation was constructed of a thing like a seashell concrete formula, and the walls and the ceiling used seashells, stone, and concrete. Now, the fort contained artillery and a 12-inch coast defense mortar batteries called Batteries Laidley and Bigelow. Sounds like a duet, right? Back in the day, though, this place had 29 buildings. It had barracks and a hospital, a guardhouse, a blacksmith, and a carpenter shop, an administrative building, because it's the military, a mess hall with a kitchen, a bakery, and a storehouse. It also had brick roads and concrete sidewalks, and even a narrow gauge railroad to help them move materials back and forth. Now, the fort here, Fort Desoto, was active from 1898 to 1910, and at least one company was present here at all times. Well, it's Florida, so mosquitoes were a problem, and it was also really hot here in the summer, which is no surprise to anyone who lives here. So in 1910, most of the Army troops were moved from Fort Desoto to Fort Morgan in Alabama, and only a caretaker force remained. And by 1914, only an ordnance sergeant and a game warden remained here. Through most of World War I, a larger caretaker force was at the post, usually about 22 privates and some non-commissioned officers and some other commissioned officers. And in 1917, 4 of Fort Desoto's mortars were disassembled and shipped to another fort out in San Diego. Finally, in November of 1922, the Army announced it would deactivate Fort Desoto and Fort Dade. And on 1924, the harbor defenses of Tampa were deactivated. By 1926, the forts had been disarmed, except for 4 12-inch mortars of Battery Laidley at Fort Desoto, which remained there. The forts were meant to be reactivated and rearmed in a time of war, but that never occurred. In the early 1930s, the Army attempted to sell the place, but there wasn't a lot of interest. But by 1938, Pinellas County bought the areas on Mullet Key for a whopping $12,500. And that's the interesting but uneventful history of Fort Desoto in Fort Desoto Park. But it still has examples of the guns. It has these really thick walled buildings which held supplies and armaments. It still gives you a hint of the fortifications that were here and what could have been used if Tampa Bay was ever in danger from naval forces out in the water. Either way, though, if you have young kids especially, it's a really cool place to hang out. So let's go on top so we can see the water from the top of the fort. Now first, isn't the water beautiful? I mean, come on. It's crazy. It's so pretty. And out there is Egmont Key. That's that separate island that Fort Dade was on and that people still go, that you can only get there by boat and hang out. But seriously, what a view, right? All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed this ride at Fort Desoto Park as much as I have, because this was awesome for me, having not been back here for probably over a decade, maybe 2. For me, a lot of flashbacks to my childhood, and I hope for you, just an enjoyable ride on a Navi, another place in Florida that you can check out virtually. And if you're ever in the area, you should really check it out in person, because it's pretty awesome. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me today. For me, time is the most valuable asset anyone has, and the fact that you invested any of that with me sincerely means a lot. Please be safe out there on the road. Be kind, be generous, and have fun. All right, I'll see you guys next time.